What is going on? This is Kyle, also known as Alien Dude here. Up for a review this time is a Balaur Arms Type 14 arming sword with bronze pommel. That name's quite the mouthful, so I'll probably just refer to it as the BA Type 14 from now on. I recently bought this sword from Cult of Athena due to the experience I've had with the BA 15th century Italian longsword. You'll find a link to that review below and at the end of this video. The Italian longsword impressed me so much that I wanted to get another piece by Balaur Arms to see if the quality would extend beyond the one model. Balaur Arms is an Indian forge that has partnered with Cult of Athena to produce a small range of budget-oriented swords. They're sold unsharpened. I believe Indian law prohibits the export of sharp swords. Most of the popular models on KOA are currently sold out, but there's rumors of some new models due soon, and I'm betting that shipment will also include restock of existing models. This sword is still in stock and retails at $259.95 US. That puts it solidly in the budget sword range. I paid KOA for their sharpening service, which delayed receiving the sword by a few days. As is usual for Cult of Athena, their shipping was fast and the box was well packaged. If you're relatively new to sword collecting, by the way, here's a little tip I had to learn the hard way. Try to save the boxes your swords ship in. You never know when you'll need to ship one somewhere, whether it's to get a scabbard made or if you decide to end up selling it secondhand. Having a supply of boxes that fits swords on hand is a whole lot easier and cheaper than buying new boxes or creating Franken boxes. Even if you think you'll never sell a sword, I still recommend saving at least a few boxes. I certainly never expected to sell any of mine, but time's proven that belief wrong. Before I go any further, let me introduce myself. I'm a computer geek and admirer of swords. I'm an amateur collector with no training in modern or historical swordsmanship, no expertise in history, and no real business being considered an expert in anything except maybe information technology. I do plan on joining a local HEMA club once conditions improve, but until then, please keep in mind that you're listening to the thoughts of an amateur. Heck, even once I join a HEMA club, I'm going to be an amateur for quite some time. This sword is marketed as an Oakshott Type 14. If you're not familiar, Ewart Oakshott was a respected historian who dedicated a great deal of time to documenting and categorizing historical European blades. He developed the Oakshott typology as a way to classify the wide variety of double-edged swords from around the 10th to the early 16th century. Oakshott types range from Type 10 to Type 22, with many types having subtypes. Why does it start at Type 10? Well, he based the numbering on previous work by Jan Petersen's classification of Viking-era swords. You can find more details in Records of the Medieval Sword, published in 1991, and probably other books by Oakshott. So, this sword is marketed as a Type 14. Technically speaking, that's not correct, as the Oakshott typology is limited to historical swords, not modern reproductions. Instead, we should probably say the sword is representative of a Type 14. That might strike you as a bit pedantic, and it is, but hey, accuracy is a good thing, right? So, what is an Oakshott Type 14? Well, it's a one-handed sword with a short grip and short blade that's broad at the hilt and tapers to a very acute point. The cross-section is generally flat, with a fuller running through half to 3/4 of the blade. The crossguards tended to be long and arched, types 6 and 7 being the most common, and the pommels were usually broad and flat with a small raised boss, pommel type K. That was probably gibberish to some people. Let's take a closer look. As a side note, this sword looks like it was inspired by a historical artifact that Oakshott documented in Records of the Medieval Sword on page 116 as 14.1. I'll do some visual comparisons to the original, but I'm not going to hold it against Balaur Arms if there's differences, since I don't see that there's any evidence this is marketed as a reproduction. First up on this sword, the most visually striking feature, the pommel. It's cast bronze in the style of an Oakshott Type J1. The construction is peened to the tang, and the peen is quite clean. There's only a few minor marks marring the surface. Inscribed in a ring around the central boss are some Latin words that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. I believe it roughly translates to, "Here too, virtue has its due reward." The casting quality is decent, though on one side of the pommel the letters are considerably less detailed. Comparing this to the original, the Latin might be different. There seems to be several opinions about what the inscription on the original says, but since I know absolutely nothing about Latin, I'm going to leave it at that. I can say the inscription on the original was engraved on silver rings that were applied to the pommel, rather than in the bronze itself like on the BA Type 14. The original also looks like it has a peen block, as opposed to the standard peen on this one. I can say the inscription on the original was engraved on silver rings that were applied to the pommel, rather than in the bronze itself. The original also looks like it has a peen block, which the BA Type 14 lacks. I found the edges of this pommel to be just a touch sharp for my taste. When held with my thumb extended along the back of the grip, I find it biting into my hand just a little bit. Holding it with the pommel more in the meat of my palm, akin to how I believe Viking-era swords were held, meant the raised boss did the biting rather than the edge. It was just uncomfortable enough to be a deterrent to holding the sword that way. Please keep in mind, I am a complete novice in swordsmanship. I'm probably doing this completely wrong. Moving on to the grip. It's a wood core with thick bands wrapped around it, then covered in leather. It's a flattened oval shape, tapering to nearly round near the pommel. The seam is nice and straight, and it's just noticeable in the hand when held. To me, the grip is both a touch long for a one-handed sword and a touch thin. I tried wielding it in several manners, as I mentioned before. The only grip that really felt right to me was with my finger wrapped around the crossguard. When I held it that way, though, it left a good 1.5 to 2 inches of unused grip before the pommel. I'm not sure that length is necessary. As for the thinness, I think that's probably just my preference based on the swords I've bought. Historically, most sword grips were thinner than many reproductions we see today. The thick bands underneath the leather are uniform in size and form a very visually appealing pattern. They're comfortable, but I find I prefer the thin cord wrap seen on Balaur Arms' Italian longsword. I think it's even more attractive, and I just like the way it feels. Let's take a look at the original. As described by Oakshot, it's a wood core bound by leather thongs and covered in thin leather. Putting pictures of them side by side, it looks to me like the BA Type 14's grip is a little longer, and the thongs are definitely chunkier. The crossguard. It's typical of an Oakshot Type 7, a long, upswept, curved guard. It's very well formed, and the edges are chamfered very nicely. I felt no discomfort at all from my hand bumping into the guard, unlike with the pommel. The fit of the blade to the crossguard is decent. It's definitely not as well done as the Italian longsword, but it doesn't have huge gaps. It does look like either the sword doesn't sit quite evenly in the notch, or the notch itself isn't perfectly straight, as the gap is larger on one side of the blade than the other. The original's crossguard looks to have a slightly more acute curve, and the ends are upswept more. The biggest difference, however, is that the original is decorated in bronze and has vertical strips of silver wire. The lack of such embellishments is to be expected on a budget sword, however. The scabbard included is wood core with a leather wrap. It comes with a steel chape, stitched drain flap, and several risers. As Affectionate War 529 mentioned on Reddit, these risers aren't just decorative, they help to secure a sword belt or frog if you're so inclined. The fit of the sword to the scabbard is very good. There's no rattle whatsoever. Actually, it might be a touch too close though. Sometimes I find myself having to tug pretty hard to get the sword out. Overall, it's a scabbard that's better than most I've received on budget swords. Let's take a look at the blade. I've put up the measurements I took of this sword for you to peruse. The first thing about them that jumps out to me is the near complete lack of distal taper. If you're not familiar with distal taper, this is the narrowing of a blade's thickness as it gets near the point. What I do is take a set of calipers and measure the thickness of the blade at several spots. This is done for several reasons. It helps reduce the weight of the blade and aids in the flexibility while still providing good strength. The BA Type 14 is a uniform 4.3 mm thick from the crossguard to just past the fuller, where it begins a slight taper to 3.5 mm just before the tip. That's not much distal taper at all. While pretty heavy for a one-hander at 2 pounds 12 ounces, 1,250 grams, feels pretty agile thanks to the point of balance being near the guard. The large and deep fuller is clearly doing good work keeping the weight down. Speaking of the fuller, it runs most of the length of the blade, terminating fairly cleanly. The lines waver here and there, but it's only really noticeable if you inspect it very closely. The central ridge after the fuller isn't quite aligned with the tip on one side of the blade. The edge geometry is typical of Cult of Athena's sharpening surface. They create a noticeable secondary bevel that is usually even and sharp. Secondary bevels get a lot of hate, and while they're not ideal, they're also not ahistorical. For me, as long as the sword cuts well, I'm pretty indifferent towards them, especially on a budget sword. There's some rippling on the surfaces of the sword. This is typically left behind either by hammer blows or the strokes as the sword is ground. It's not a big deal, but less ripple shows attention to detail. I tried to capture the ripples on camera, but I'm not sure how well I succeeded. Going back to the original, the first thing that's different is that the original had letters etched into the fuller, but they were indecipherable when Oakeshott documented the sword. They're barely noticeable in the pictures, so it's not surprising Balaur Arms left them out entirely. Like the original, this sword has a flattened diamond cross-section from the fuller to the tip. This is actually unusual for a Type 14, which typically would have a lenticular cross-section. Oakeshott noted that this really should have caused the original to be classified as a Type 16, but he decided the overall shape it was just too typical of a 14 to call it anything else. The sword has what I consider to be the proper amount of flex to it. It returns to true after bending and doesn't feel whippy in the slightest. From some discussions I've read, Balaur Arms has had some inconsistency here, with some of their blades ending up too flexible. People have described them as noodles. The two BA swords I've owned have not had this issue at all, though. Before I talk about cutting, here's a quick reminder. I'm a novice at swordsmanship, with no real training. My form is poor. I try to focus on control rather than force or speed, letting the blade do the actual work, but any failed cuts you see are much more likely to be my fault than the sword's. With that out of the way, I had some problems cutting with this sword. As I mentioned earlier, it took me several tries to find a comfortable and effective grip. Holding it in a handshake grip caused the pommel to bite into my hand, whereas wrapping my finger around the crossguard and resting it against the ricasso was uncomfortable, because then the thin ricasso ended up biting into my finger. In the end, I decided to wear gloves. They provided enough protection that all discomfort was removed. This is probably the way this type of sword was used historically. They would have wanted as much hand protection as possible while maintaining range of movement when in a sword fight, because the hands make for such great targets. So it's not really a mark against the sword that I feel like I needed gloves to use it. I just prefer bare hands. When it came to pool noodles, each time I cut, I was able to get the first cut to be even and clean, but after that, I really struggled to get anything through. Most of the time, the pool noodle just bent out of the way. My cuts on water bottles were better, although I did have a couple really bad attempts. Still, the BA Type 14 did pretty well here. I'm going to attribute my difficulty cutting to a few factors. First, and most importantly, my technique and edge alignment. As I've said, I'm a complete novice at this, and I struggle with consistent edge alignment. I could probably compensate with a bit more force, but I think controlling the blade is more important. Secondly, even when wearing gloves, I never really felt particularly comfortable with the grip. As I mentioned, it feels a little thin, and I think that contributed to my difficulty. Lastly, and likely the least important, I think the edge is not quite as sharp and a little more inconsistent than I'm used to from Cult of Athena's sharpening surface. It's still serviceably sharp. You don't need a razor's edge on a sword, and actually that's counterproductive, as it would take damage far too easily. I think in the hands of somebody with better technique, it would cut just fine. I'm going to wrap things up with some final thoughts. I really like the overall look of the BA Type 14. It's a beautiful sword that is clearly identifiable as inspired by the original. The balance and flexibility feel right to me, and it seems solidly constructed. I do wish the grip was a little better though. I find it a bit long and a bit thin. I've seen some people use grip bands on swords to adjust the feel of a grip, and I might do that here to see if I can make it fit better. It's completely ahistorical, of course, but if it makes it work better, I'm all for it. Overall, I think this sword is worth the price, even with my problems cutting. I think it's a good budget choice for a Type 14, even though there are other well-reviewed options out there. Generally speaking, I really like Type 14 swords, so I think there's a good chance I will end up buying one of those other budget options and getting a review done on it. That's for another day though. Alright, this review has gone on way longer than I anticipated, so I think it's time to bring it to an end. Thank you so much for watching and listening to my amateurish opinions. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe. Until next time, Alien Toot out.